Okay, good afternoon. Oh, are we live? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. We are the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment. My name is Robert Hawkins. I am the MLA for Yellowknife Centre and the Chair of Standing Committee on Economic Development. Today we have a committee hearing with the officials from the Crown-Indigenous Relations and Indigenous Affairs Canada regarding the committee's ongoing review of the land and water use regulatory framework. Please note that this meeting is being live streamed through the Assembly's channel. And of course, as a reminder to all parties present and online, we need to ensure that all conversations go through the chair and all mics need to be managed and on at the time. Otherwise, those online or the millions of followers around the world will not be able to hear us. Now, at this particular time, I'm going to quickly introduce members just to move things along quickly. On my left, I have MLA Shauna Morgan, MLA for Yellowknife North. On my right, I have Ms. Kate Reed, MLA for Great Slave. Online, I have MLA Danny McNeely, MLA for LaSalle 2, MLA George Narasu for MLA Mackenzie Delta, and MLA Julian Morris for Frame Lake. That said, my understanding is we have our presenters both online, and I'd like to allow them to introduce themselves. So I will pass the microphone on to our presenters. If you could both introduce yourselves, and once you do that, please feel free to proceed with your presentation. And just before I do that, I think because our presenters are online, we must be controlling the presentation. So if you folks could indicate when you wish for us to change the slide, we'll adjust it accordingly. And if we get too far or too slow, don't feel it'll hurt our feelings if you let us know. So if you would begin, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Rebecca Spinard, and I am the Director of Resource Policy and Programs with Crown-Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada, or CERNAC for short.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. I'm Kim Hawley, the Director of Environment and Renewable Resources with Northern Affairs, also at CERNAC.
And Mr. Chair, would you like us to just jump right into it now?
Yeah, absolutely. And now, one thing I didn't mention, which I have started to mention as of yesterday, when questions are directed, I'll just proceed forward for the person who raises their hand. And if you need to pass on, it's two of you together, so this is kind of nice. We're not switching back and forth too much. That said, please begin with your presentation, and we'll take it from there.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the invitation to appear before this committee. We appreciate the additional information your team provided to us about the role and objectives of this committee, and we hope that we can provide you with information to help advance your objectives. Unfortunately, we couldn't be with you there in person today, but are glad to be participating virtually from Gatineau, Quebec, on the traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe. Next slide, please. So some of the themes and topics that we'll be speaking about today will pick up on the themes that have already been presented to you by the NWT and Nunavut Chamber of Mines and the Mackenzie Valley Land and Water Board. I'll start with a quick background on the Northern regulatory regimes because this context is extremely important to keep in mind as we think about resource management in the Northwest Territories. I'll share with you some information about the Canadian Critical Mineral Strategy and specifically elements under the Northern Regulatory Initiative that are led by CERNAC. These include updates on the regional study in the Slave Geological Province of the Northwest Territories and the Mackenzie Valley Operational Dialogue. I'll provide information on the Northern Participant Funding Program and highlight some opportunities for consideration before we move to questions. Next slide. So you heard about the structure of the regulatory regime in the Mackenzie Valley from the Mackenzie Valley Land and Water Board yesterday, but this context bears repeating because it is so integral to the resource management structures across the North, and it is something that sets these regimes apart from others across the country. So across the North, traditional territories that are formalized by modern treaties or comprehensive land claim and self-government agreements provide clarity and predictability with respect to land rights, ownership, and resource management responsibilities. These treaties provide for the establishment of resource management structures, such as co-management boards, and detail resource management roles and responsibilities that guarantee Indigenous participation and, in some cases, decision-making. Northern resource management legislation, such as the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act, or the MVRMA, incorporate these commitments. When considering things like legislative amendments or interpretation or regulatory changes, it is important to do so alongside these modern treaties and in the context of Section 35 rights that are protected under the Constitution Act of 1982. You cannot simply change or consider legislative amendments in isolation from these treaties. Northern regulatory processes are integrated, coordinated, and participatory. Co-management boards rely on evidence that is submitted by governments and organizations, community members, elders, and other interested parties and experts to inform their decisions and their recommendations. Federal and territorial ministers also have some decision-making authorities under the MVRMA. For example, they have responsibility to approve or not approve water licenses for major projects such as mines, following recommendations made by the Land and Water Boards. With the implementation of the Devolution Agreement in 2014, the administration and control of most public lands is now held by the government of the Northwest Territories, with a few exceptions. Less than 8% of the territory remains under federal jurisdiction, with less than 1% of NWT lands managed by CERNAC. And those CERNAC-managed federal areas are primarily restricted to contaminated sites. So the majority of ministerial decisions relating to project authorizations, for example, rest with the territorial minister, not the federal minister. Territorial resource management legislation mirrors the federal legislation, which allows for a common set of rules and criteria across federal and non-federal lands. Adherence to modern treaty commitments and the resource management structures created under these treaties remains a requirement under both federal and territorial legislation. Next slide, please. So in December of 2022, Natural Resources Canada launched the Canadian Critical Minerals Strategy, with the objective to increase the supply of responsibly sourced critical minerals and support the development of domestic and global value chains for the green and digital economy. The strategy identifies 34 minerals that are important or critical for transitioning to a green and digital economy and towards reaching Canada's net zero targets. These include minerals that are needed for things like electric vehicles, electronics, and batteries. The Northwest Territories has 23 of the 34 minerals, and the Slave Geological Province, which spans the Northwest Territories and Nunavut, has been identified as a priority area. Next slide, please.
Our tech is moving slow, just so you know. If you want to continue, we'll move. Yeah.
Okay. I can keep talking and the slides can catch up if that works for you. So the Northern Regulatory Initiative, or the NRI, is a component of the Critical Minerals Strategy. It's led by CERNAC, and it includes $40 million over 7 years across all three territories to support efficient, effective, and inclusive Northern regulatory regimes. This initiative goes back to my earlier slide on the background context of the Northern resource management regimes and how the regimes reflect and rely on participation, rights, holistic approaches, and the co-management nature of the regimes. Resources under the NRI are focused on providing funds to support participation and impact assessment and land use planning processes, to improve clarity and coordination on Crown consultation processes, strategies to support regional approaches to resource management, including regional studies and cumulative effect studies, are being supported, in addition to forums that bring parties together to collectively discuss regulatory perspectives, challenges, and priorities, and to collaborate on solutions. So $40 million over 7 years in 3 large territories is not a lot, but it is a start. We hope that by working with partners across the North to design and roll out actions in these focus areas, that we will be successful in filling gaps and providing more clarity and certainty to developers, reviewers, rights holders, governments, and other parties who participate in the regulatory systems. The overarching objective of the initiative is very much in line with your committee's objectives, however, from a pan-territorial federal context. A couple of the initiatives that are specific to the Northwest Territories are currently underway under the regional and cumulative effects studies and multi-party regulatory dialogue table focus areas. Next slide, please. So regional studies can be designed in different ways for different purposes, but generally they take a regional approach to looking at impacts from development, both positive and negative, to help inform planning, decisions, or positions. They are not project assessments. They take a holistic approach to thinking about the future vision of a region rather than focusing on a specific development project. There's a growing interest in regional studies, or regional strategic environmental assessments, they're called sometimes, across Canada and internationally. From an NRI lens, regional studies will help to provide information at a regional scale that will in turn inform project proceedings or planning processes. This is meant to take some of the pressure off individual project developers who may otherwise be asked to provide a wealth of regional data for their single project. And it will also help to inform positions, recommendations, and decisions of participants in the regulatory system. For the Northwest Territories, there is a clear legislative foundation for regional studies, which was introduced into the MVRMA in 2019. So Part 5.2 of the MVRMA states that the federal minister may establish a committee to conduct a regional study, appoint persons to that committee, and establish a terms of reference for the committee after seeking and considering advice from the government of the Northwest Territories, the Tlicho government, and other affected First Nations. A final report is to be prepared by the committee, and the report must be considered in regulatory processes. In June of 2021, the Tlicho government Grand Chief requested a regional study in the Slave Geological Province so that good information is available to help inform major anticipated development. He said that an evidence-based, non-political assessment would help show the full picture of potential impacts, benefits, and trade-offs for the area. The Slave Geological Province, or the SGP, is recognized as a large area, primarily in the Northwest Territories, but it does span into Nunavut, that has significant mineral potential, including critical minerals. It is also the region where major new infrastructure is being contemplated, specifically the Lockhart All-Season Road. And the area has great ecological value for caribou and has great value for culture, well-being, and way of life for many Indigenous peoples whose traditional territories are in this region. A proactive study to look at baseline and cumulative impacts of potential development scenarios in this area would help inform future development decisions to ensure that these values can be reconciled. At the time of the request, there was no dedicated source of funds to support this ask. However, the announcement of the critical minerals strategy provided an opportunity to resource this study. Next slide. In February of 2023, the Minister of Northern Affairs expressed his support to advance the study and laid out criteria to help frame the design. These criteria included a fair and transparent process that maximizes participation, the need to identify impacts to caribou and strategies for mitigation, the need to consider northern priorities such as the social, cultural, and economic well-being of residents, climate change adaptation and mitigation, and the objectives of the critical mineral strategy. He clarified that the study was to focus on the Northwest Territory portion of the Slave Geological Province, and that it should be designed so that outcomes can be considered for the near-term anticipated development over the course of the next 2 to 3 years, and consider how the outcomes can be useful into the future. And finally, that the study shall not interrupt any existing regulatory or planning processes. A workshop was held in early 2023 to discuss the criteria and the design or the governance of the study. Collaboration on drafting the terms of reference for the minister's consideration is currently being conducted by federal, territorial, and Indigenous governments. The terms of reference will lay out the governance for the study, including the establishment of a committee to lead the study and opportunities for public participation throughout the course of the study itself. This step is taking time, but we need to set it up right in a good way so that the study itself will be successful. And the hope is to have a recommendation for the minister to consider ready by this fall or winter. Next slide. The Northern Regulatory Initiative also supports multi-party forums that aim to identify and discuss regulatory challenges and opportunities with partners outside of project-specific proceedings, and then to collaborate on solutions. The focus area of the NRI builds off of the Mackenzie Valley Operational Dialogue, or MVOD, that was established in 2020. MVOD was designed to provide a venue for resource management partners to collaborate on specific and prioritized regulatory operational improvements. It originated from a request from industry to establish a forum where operational challenges could be discussed outside of project proceedings. The government of the Northwest Territories has been involved in this initiative since its inception. To date, the scope has focused on small-scale mineral exploration, primarily in the Southeast Northwest Territories, where the majority of junior exploration companies are active. MVOD's overall objectives are to advance regulatory operations using a dialogue-first approach by seeking to understand issues from various perspectives and collectively building solutions that do not require legislative amendments, and to create a forum where resource management partners can meet to provide updates on regulatory initiatives, ask questions, share knowledge, discuss challenges, and collaborate on actions. This initiative is also a direct example of how the government of the Northwest Territories and CERNAC are working together to address the recommendation from the NWT environmental audit, which is to establish a process for parties to meet and discuss regulatory challenges and opportunities. The Mackenzie Valley Operational Dialogue has more recently provided for a venue for partners to provide updates on broader regulatory initiatives, including updates on the critical mineral strategy, and to raise or explain requests for non-operational solutions, such as the request by the Land and Water Board to amend the water regulations. The most recent MVOD session was held in May this year in Yellowknife. Next slide, please. So there have been some tangible and some less tangible outcomes flowing from MVOD sessions. I would argue that one of the important yet less tangible outcomes flowing from this table has been the learning that has occurred in the building and strengthening of relationships. Understanding each other's perspectives and experiences, along with the histories and legal framework of the system, can help us to focus on shared priorities. For example, if developers and reviewers, including Indigenous governments and organizations, are all expressing concerns about capacity constraints due to the need to prepare or review large quantities of documents, it opens up a conversation about scales of economy and risk-based approaches to resource management. More doesn't mean better, and in fact, more can sometimes add more hay to a pile that contains the needle that represents what is important to people. Similarly, trying to implement quick fixes or changes without involving rights holders and treaty partners can lead to lengthy court processes and/or damage important relationships, which does not result in a quick fix at all. Talking can help us to collectively define problem statements and design solutions together. These forums also help to inform parties around the table, including the federal and territorial governments who may need to seek authorities and/or resources to advance actions. Again, the request for amendments to the water regulations is an example of how discussions at the MVOD forum have helped us to understand the issue from multiple perspectives. A tangible action flowing from MVOD has been the development of an analytic tracker by the Land and Water Boards. This tracker depicts statistics for projects, including the quantity and timelines for different types of developments and reviews. It is a tool that can help put facts on the table so that we have a better chance of defining where the problems or challenges lie. And finally, there has been a focus on outreach and education so that people participating in the system have a better understanding of the projects they are reviewing. The last MBOD session in May included a focus on lithium exploration, where Northern experts, government officials, and academics provided information about lithium. The session also included a field component to look at lithium in the natural environment. There is still more to be done, and efforts are underway to advance other priorities that have been flagged at MBOD sessions, including strategies to improve capacity, mainly for Indigenous governments and organizations, and requests to explore amendments to the water regulations. Yesterday, you heard from the Land and Water Boards who are leading efforts relating to information requirements and strategies to remove the hay so we can find the needle. More work is being done to develop the analytics tool as well. So for example, we've heard from industry that simple timeline charts don't always tell the whole story. A permit to use land might be issued quickly, but may include conditions that don't make sense or prevent certain actions from occurring. It would be helpful to include some qualitative data in this analytic tool to help better define issues. So that's something that the boards will be working on. The next virtual MBOD session will occur in the fall or winter. The date has yet to be determined. And this will be an opportunity to better define the priorities and actions that are coming out of the session that was held in May. Next slide, please. Another federal support to the Mackenzie Valley Regulatory Framework is the Northern Participant Funding Program, or the NPFP. And this was mentioned yesterday as well by the Land and Water Boards. This program was established in 2018 for impact assessment projects and further extended in 2023 for another 5 years. The NPFP program supports Indigenous governments and organizations and Northerners to facilitate their meaningful participation in the impact assessment process established under land claim agreements in Canada's 3 territories. In 2023, the program was expanded to also include regulatory processes. So that is a new element to the program. However, it should be noted that that element has very limited funding at this time. Next slide, please. So while the Government of Canada's role is small in the regulatory regime within the Northwest Territories, CERNAC is committed to working with other Northern partners on approaches to improve the clarity, certainty, and efficiency of the system. These approaches must consider the context and history of the regime. Rights and commitments and treaties must be at the forefront of our thinking. Coordination between the federal and territorial governments is important to ensuring projects are being regulated in a consistent way, regardless of whether they exist on federal or non-federal lands. We seek to uplift the co-management system that exists in the Northwest Territories, the system that has been designed with treaty partners by supporting boards and independent board-led processes, and by looking for ways to support meaningful participation in regulatory processes. Our actions and messaging about the regulatory system should reflect this support. At the same time, we need to listen to users of the system, such as industry, to understand the real challenges they're facing on the ground. We must think about the environmental and the economic impacts of moving projects forward and the environmental and economic impacts of not moving projects forward. I'm thinking about the objectives of the critical minerals strategy, for example, and what is needed to transition to a green economy, meet net zero targets, and support clean growth projects. If there are things we can do to eliminate regulatory barriers without causing harm to rights, people, or the environment, or things we can do to help focus attention on the things that matter, we should be listening. We need to listen to each other to ensure solutions aren't creating new problems. Forums like the Mackenzie Valley Operational Dialogue help to bring people together to have these conversations and help to build the relationships and trust that is needed to unstick complex problems. Progress moves at the speed of trust. One thing that I have observed in the Northwest Territories is the dedication and goodwill of the people working in this space. Whether they're from governments, communities, industries, or boards, many of us have been working together on these topics for decades, and everybody cares deeply about these issues. Our relationships are our strength. We need to harness that energy and turn it into action, and we'll be more effective if we are all rowing in the same direction. Next slide, please. So with that, I thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members, for your time and attention. We look forward to engaging in questions and and supporting your objectives as best we can. Masicho.
Thank you, Director Chenard. Okay, folks, now it's the exciting question time. I'm looking for members who would like to start us off by asking questions. Do we have any members in the room? I'm looking at, Ms. Morgan would like to go first. And just before we proceed with Ms. Morgan, if members online want to let our clerk know when, if you'd like to ask questions, please send her a quick message and we'll follow up accordingly when we find out who wants to participate, if they're able to. Ms. Morgan, if you would like to lead us off, please, if you would.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for your time today and making this informative presentation. My question is about the regional study. On that slide, it said that under the criteria or the terms that it would be designed to analyze near-term development over the next 2 to 3 years. So, I mean, if we're talking about something like the Slave Geological Province Road, I mean, design and building of a road like that itself is probably going to take far longer than 2 to 3 years. Can you explain why the time frame of 2 to 3 years was chosen, when my understanding was that the intention of the regional study was to look at what the potential, impacts and ramifications of broad-scale development across the region would be, which would, take probably at least 10 years to unfold. So what's the rationale for the 2 to 3 years? Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Chenard, do you want to start off with that?
Sure, yes, happy to answer that question. The reason for the 2 to 3 years was to get a sense of the information in advance of the project application entering into the system, so that that information would be there and could be used to inform the project itself. So again, this regional study isn't replacing a project assessment. Project assessments will always occur, and deep analysis of the specific project will continue as has been done, for many years. So this doesn't replace a project assessment. The 2 to 3 years was built on anticipated timelines for the Government of the Northwest Territories application for the Broad Road. So the thinking was, if we could take stock of all of the different data that currently exists, and build sort of different development scenarios around potential development in that area, and gather as much information as possible, that report itself would help inform the project application once it was received. So that was the intent of the 2 to 3 years. I should also note that one study isn't meant to be the be-all, end-all. I think this study can be viewed as the foundational or a first step in helping to organize and collect and figure out what information and what information gaps currently exist. There's lots of cumulative effects studies happening. There's lots of baseline data out there. There's data portals that exist from different departments and different initiatives. But if that information isn't compiled in a way that's easy to use, and if it isn't submitted to the boards as evidence, it's not considered. And so, this regional study is meant to help compile and organize that information in a way that then can be used in board-led proceedings.
Thank you for that answer. And just before I go to MLA Morgan once again, online I have in the queue for questions, I have MLA Morris and then MLA Narasu. Just give them a virtual heads up, then followed by MLA Reed. Okay. So folks, Ms. Morgan, if you'd like to ask your second question, we'll proceed.
Thank you. So I think I misunderstood what the slide was trying to tell us. I thought you meant that what the study was trying to analyze was what development would take place over the next 2 to 3 years. But I think what you're saying is that the study itself is designed to be completed within 2 to 3 years. Okay, that wasn't clear in the beginning. And so then I guess the next follow-up question is, 2 to 3 years from when? Because it's already taken, well, from when the minister committed to do a regional study. I think we're still waiting to get a terms of reference off the ground. So I guess 2 to 3 years starting when, and what is your timeline for when this analysis will actually begin? Thank you.
Thank you. Director Chenard, if you'd like to take that one, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. That's a great question. 2 to 3 years from when the study is initiated, and we hope that will be soon. The target is fall, winter for having a recommendation for the federal minister, but the process to get there is a collaborative process with other governments. And so, at this stage, I have to be mindful and respectful of the other governments that we're working with to talk about that governance structure. So, I can't give you all of the details about those discussions to date, other than the importance of us trying our best to reach consensus around the governance structure of that study. I think everybody recognizes that it's important that we get there soon so that the study is actually helpful to anticipated near-term development projects like the all-season road. And so I do think there is a lot of goodwill around the table, and that we're getting pretty close to a place where a recommendation to the minister can be made. So I can't guarantee what that timeline will look like, and it's dependent on many factors and other governments around the table, but our target is the fall or winter to launch the study.
Thank you for that. I'll now recognize MLA Morris, if you would like to weigh in at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for presenting, coming to committee and presenting. I appreciate it. I wanted to. I didn't want to get too far down the rabbit hole of the regional study because I have questions about the regulatory framework also. But since we're on the topic, the regional study. My understanding is this is the first time one of these will be done under the MVRMA. So I think that part of the delay and part of the kind of figuring out the governance stuff taking a bit longer is probably got to do with the fact that we don't have precedents to look to. I know I have some constituents who have raised a lot of questions about this study and how it's going to play out. And I think that their questions are kind of related more to how the study itself is going to progress through the system. And I'm curious to know, in terms of scoping out the study itself, what the study's parameters are, how the study proceeds and what the study looks at, and levels of public participation in that. My understanding, based on what you guys have shared in your presentation, is that this is the kind of work that will occur once the study is established. So can you maybe speak a bit to how the study is going to play out, if it's going to look similar to the process for an EA where there's kind of a, engagement on a terms of reference, and then there's engagement, as the EA progresses through a number of steps. I know that it's not an EA, so it might be different, but I think it would be helpful for people to kind of better understand what the study is going to look like and where the opportunities for public participation are going to occur. So that's my first question. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Morris. Ms. Director Schwinar, if you would, with that.
Sure, yeah, that's a good question. And you're correct, this is the first regional study request that has come in under that new provision, or section 5.2 of the MVRMA. So there is a bit of a learning curve occurring, although other requests could look very different. And I suspect, looking at other examples around Canada and around the world, it does appear as though this first step, setting up the study, is an important step, and it does take time, regardless of where the study is. There's many, different factors to consider. What's different about this study, the terms of reference is a terms of reference for the committee, and it speaks largely to the governance structure. There are terms of references for other studies that focus more on the study itself. So we are anticipating, the regional study and the SGP to include a work plan. And that work plan would detail sort of the different phases and how and when public participation would occur. So it's not exactly the same as a impact assessment process, but there would be a lot of the similar characteristics in terms of, public sessions and that kind of thing is what is envisioned at this point in time. So I think once, the details of that study, once that terms of reference is in place, there will be an opportunity to shape it to some extent. I think something that we need to be cautious of, and that is coming up in our conversations, is, the risk of putting everything into this study. We're trying to be realistic about the time frame that we have. And we're trying to be respectful of the request that came in from the Taoiseach government. And I think that there's a lot of discussion happening at the moment about, what can this study do? Can we start small and focused and do something that's achievable and useful within a 2 to 3 year period of time and use that to build off of? And what are the really important things that we need to ensure are included in that study. So, it's, yes, for sure, there will be the opportunity for public participation and to help shape that study. I would just say there's some caution there about thinking this study can do it all in that short amount of time, and a need to be respectful to honor the spirit of the request itself.
Thank you for that. Just as a reminder to both the people who ask questions, no reflection of the current question asker, but as well as the person providing the answer, we're taking approximately about a 10-minute cycle to go through 2 questions, and we may not meet our 3 o'clock cutoff. So that said, I'd hate to see the last person on the list be not given an opportunity or making it unfair to them. So try to use your time wisely, everyone, and that applies to all members, including myself. So I now go back to Mr. Morse, and for your second question, please.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. So my next question, shifting gears a little bit, is just to kind of focus on the study that committee is doing right now, and that is to paraphrase and put it in short terms, looking at things that committee can focus on for GNWT to change within the system, because of course that's our jurisdiction. We can't look at all the parties. So I was hoping to get from Cernak, if you have any feedback, either through your experiences in MVOD or otherwise, on things that you'd be interested in seeing, or things that you think we could recommend that GNWT could look at changing, whether it be the legislation as was recommended by the boards and by the Cleachon government, or if there's other things. And maybe to put a bit more specifics on it, I saw that you guys have a pot of funding that you've established under the critical minerals strategy. So are there things that GNWT could be accessing there that they currently aren't, or what are some things that GNWT could be doing differently from what it's doing currently that would help the system move more efficiently?
Thank you, Emily Morris. Dr. Schwinar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I could respond to this question for a full hour, I think. So I'll take your direction and try to be as quick as possible, and maybe just highlight a couple key points that I think are important. The first thing is, I think it's not just what the GNWT and the federal government, for that matter, do. It's how we do it. And so I think, there's reason to be cautious of quick fixes and rushing to solutions without talking to people and working with people, including treaty partners and rights holders and industry and others who participate in the resource management systems. So I think we should be collectively thinking about who needs to be at the table to have the conversations to get to solutions that are going to work. doing something fast and ending up in court doesn't end up being very fast. So I think we all have to be mindful of that. Something that came out yesterday with the Land and Water Board's presentation was the idea of pathfinding and, you know, the whole of government approaches to these complex issues. And I think there's something there that we should all be paying attention to. It's not just one department that has the answers. It's not the economic development arm or the environmental arm or the intergovernmental relationships arm. Often these topics spread across different departments, and working collectively with a whole of government approach and thinking about those overarching guiding principles, I think is an important way to frame all of these conversations, including, you know, is this action going to support the system in place? Is it going to uplift the board-led processes? Is it going to respect rights? Is it going to lead to operational efficiencies? So I think all of those things need to come into our thinking when we're working on these problems. I think working together, you know, if there's any legislative changes or contemplations to changing regulations or legislation, I think it's important for the government of the Northwest Territories to work with the federal government. I did mention, you know, if one government changes their legislation or regulations and the other doesn't, you're going to have different rules. You know, if you have a company that spans different land types, federal and non-federal areas, think of how complex that would look if there were different rules, depending on which you know, if you step over an imaginary line, that won't be very efficient or effective. And I think there is a lot of room in the operational or implementation space. I think some of the questioning that came up yesterday was around templates and, you know, standardized language and that kind of thing. And I think the government of the Northwest Territories can be working closely with boards to figure out where there are operational efficiencies to try to streamline some of those things where there's no environmental or rights issues at play. So maybe I'll just leave it at that.
Emily Morris, I'll put you on the list again. We're running. Time isn't moving as swiftly as possible. Again, when we're confronted with the 3 p.m. Cutoff, we might be able to squeeze a couple extra minutes from my understanding, just to ensure all members have an equal chance. That said, I now would like to recognize Mr. Narasu, MLA for Mackenzie Delta, and then following him will be MLA Reid and MLA McNeely. So, Mr. Narasu, if you would please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your presentation. I'll just tie two of my questions together. And this is in regards to the funding allocation, $40 million over 7 years. What challenges, if any, has the regulatory regime has faced due to these limited financial resources that are currently available? And has the regime requested more finances? And what is the outcome of the request? Thank you.
Thank you for such a swift and effective question. Ms. Bernard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll try to be swift in my response and say, you know, the program is new. So we've just finished the first year, and that was, you know, a lot of that time was spent talking to partners and trying to figure out, you know, how to advance different priorities across the 3 territories. So yeah, we're trying to respond to the challenges that we've heard about over working in this space over many, many years. Primarily, I'd say the ability for Indigenous governments and organizations to meaningfully participate in processes. So, you know, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to think about how to do that strategically. We've heard there's a desire to think longer term. So if we can find ways to fund capacity over, you know, multiple years, that would help parties plan better and build internal capacity. I think partnering with the territorial government on capacity initiatives is important. Early conversations are underway about secondment opportunities, that kind of thing. I think we need to keep going and having those, exploring what could be done. So at this point, we have not requested additional funding. It's too early. But as noted, through forums like MVOD, if we can build a business case around why we need more funding, if we can show success, show that, when we support participation in these systems, it becomes more clear, it becomes more effective, then, all that data will help us to build that case.
Thank you for that. Mr. Narasu, do you have a follow-up, please?
Okay, just going in another direction. How much authority does the non-payment group have with the regulatory regime, and can they delay a project where the rest of the NWT feel it would be beneficial for the whole NWT as a whole? This is just like maybe just somewhere where they're trying to advance their talks with the federal government and may try to delay a worthy project. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Schwarnark, please.
Yeah, I think that question was in relation to the ability for Indigenous governments and organizations who don't have modern treaties to participate in the system. Is that, am I understanding that question correctly?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I do think that is an area that has been flagged. Yesterday the boards talked about their perspectives paper and other recommendations that have been brought forward. And on that list is always settle land claims, settle self-government agreements. And so I do think that is something that certainly would help provide clarity and certainty and help, with buy-in and support of the system in the Northwest Territories. In the absence of settled modern treaties, there's still lots of space for participation. There's still the ability for Indigenous governments and organizations to nominate people for some boards. And a lot of the funding under the NRI is targeted for grants and contributions for Indigenous governments and organizations that are not otherwise funded. So a lot of the target is for those governments and organizations that do not have modern treaties. That's where we find a lot of the capacity constraints rest. And so that's the focus, the primary focus, I'd say, of our contribution agreements under the NRI.
And thank you for that. I now would like to recognize MLA Reid, and then of course after her I have Mr. McNeely, and anyone else would like to follow up on a further round. At this point, MLA.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the presenters for their presentation. MLA Narasu kind of stole my thunder, but that's okay. This is an important topic. I want to continue. So when we talk about the Northern Regulatory Initiative, 40 million over 7 years for 3 territories, as you mentioned in your presentation, that's a fairly small, limited funding. And as you heard from the previous presenters, specifically the Land and Water Boards yesterday, capacity building in Indigenous governments and organizations is necessary for a truly inclusive regulatory regime. So I understand from what you've told MLA Narasu, there's only a certain amount of pot of funding. The Northern Participant Funding Program is also limited. So what other avenues is CERNAC or Canada looking into to provide to set up Indigenous governments and organizations for success in this regard, noting that, as you've said yourself, it's of key importance for their full participation in your presentation. I know we just spoke about the secondment, partnering with the GNWT, having that data to build the case. These things take time, but what other avenues is CERNAC looking at right now to seek out other connections within the federal government that might support IGOs better? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. That was a good question. Ms. Director Schwernard, please.
Yeah, I'd say, yeah, for sure, you know, in terms of participating in regulatory processes, funding under the NRI and the Northern Participant Funding Program, I think are both examples of how, you know, funding we can tap into for those processes. I mentioned the regulatory portion of the Northern Participant Funding Program. That's a new area that we're exploring right now in terms of seeing if there's ways to expand access and ability to, you know, expand that program, looking at strategic ways to use the NRI funds to create more certainty in the secondment program. So those are all things that we're doing right now. I'd say for board-led processes for supporting boards, there's regular funding in place, but there's also pressure funding. So if there's a big project or something that comes along that, you know, they would put in a special ask for funding through their implementation agreements to support those project-specific processes. But I guess in terms of regulatory processes, those are the things that are in place. I think if there's other, if IGOs or Indigenous governments and organizations are interested in participating in other specific processes, there's always the ability for, you know, sometimes we do get funding requests for specific things. There are other programs that CERNAC and other departments lead, linked to climate adaptation and mitigation, or, you know, Indigenous-led energy programs and things like that. So as far as funding to participate in regulatory processes, those are the, you know, the federal funding that we have available. I know there's IRMA funding and other things that GNWT offers. Don't know, Kim, if there's more that.
Yeah, not so much CERNAC, but I would just say particularly for the more advanced projects going through regulatory reviews, other departments such as Fisheries and Oceans Canada have similar participation or capacity funding pots to facilitate engagement in their regulatory processes. So we always try to take a whole of government approach when communicating those funding pots that are available to Indigenous governments and organizations.
Okay. Thank you for that. Looks like I'm going on, just double checking with Ms. Reid. Yeah, oh, thank you. Ms. Reid, if you'd like a follow-up, I thought you waved it off earlier, so just checking, please, if you would.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and I just really want to highlight this issue simply because it is, as you note, a whole of government approach, both Canada and the GNWT, wherever we can support folks to build that capacity. And I'm just looking for perhaps something that doesn't exist currently, and that's fine. What I understand about this particular part of the problems that we're hearing around this table as we delve into this project is that that's a key part of the puzzle piece that can be really missing in the terms of Indigenous government capacity to actually take the time and participate and review all of these projects. So I guess I'm just giving a comment more than a question, but it's my hope that CERNAC works at the federal level to ensure all available funding can be creative and approachable for IGOs to take part in regulatory processes. Thank you.
Thank you for that. It was a comment, but that said, I'll certainly give the presenter if they an opportunity if they'd like to sort of respond to that, or if there's anything they'd like to clarify. Please, Director Schwinar.
Yeah, I agree with all of those statements, and I think we are certainly willing to put our heads together with the heads of the territorial government officials and others to try to find creative ways to fill that gap. And that's what we hear from, not just Indigenous governments and organizations, but the lack of capacity affects, developers and boards and everything else. So yeah, it's certainly an area that requires attention. Long-term, consistent, predictable funding and capacity.
Thank you for that. I'd now like to recognize MLA McNeely, who's online. And when you're ready, sir, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the presentation. When I was involved, or still am involved to some degree here with industry, and attended the last mining roundup forum there, or conference there in Vancouver. It seems like there's a lot of and still a lot of concerns on the lengthy regulatory process, and I'm glad to hear that you had NVOB to have a public engagement. Is there a what we heard report from your May NVOB conference? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, MLA McNeely. Director Schwinar, when you're ready.
Yes, all of the presentations and materials that have come out of MVOD sessions, both from May, but previous ones as well, are posted on the Land and Water Board's website. So all of that information is there. I will note, some of the things that we're hearing about the MVOD sessions is the desire for more and more and more and more people to participate. And then the challenge of those meetings being sort of roll up your sleeve action meetings. And so I think we're at a bit of a crossroads right now in terms of, should those forums be open to more people to talk broadly about these issues, and then, action teams kind of go off and piece together follow-up plans on how to action these things, versus keeping the room really tight and focused on people who are involved specifically in specific topics that have been flagged as issues. So all of that to say is yes, all of that information is there, and stay tuned as we work with other partners on that initiative for updates on next sessions and call outs for who and how you can participate.
Okay, thank you. I got another question there, Mr. Chair.
Oh, please proceed.
My next question is that we all seem to be active stakeholders and players into this regulatory governance to try and encourage economic outcomes. When we listen to industry, it's the length of process, and I guess the latest one, to give you some timeline, we heard from Loyal Lithium here last a number of months ago. It takes 12 years to get what you want there, and 2 years elsewhere in Canada. So if I'm from an oil and gas region or a investment potential region, I'm going to say, well, I'm sorry here. I'm going to take my money elsewhere. I'm going to see a faster return on my capital. So based on that, I'm going to go down to Brazil. But we don't want that. Is there, and we have an agreement we've got the devolution agreement. Can we expand on that? Is there willingness to expand on that? To have a devolution committee that would build on implementing the provisions of that committee, of that agreement, to expedite what we heard from MVOB and other conferences, whether it's PDAC or the mining roundup in Vancouver, which the investment and explorers community are all saying the same thing. It takes too long. Like I think another example would be the Critical Mineral Infrastructure Fund. I'm not too sure how much approval to the applications that was submitted are actually out the door now, or there's still some underneath review. So examples of delays is going on. So is there a willingness on CERNAC to act on behalf of the federal government to maybe entertain the idea of a devolution committee to look at expediting MVOB concerns or concerns from the mining community? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, MLA McNeely. Director Schwinar, please, if you could.
Yes, thanks for the question. I think there's a couple different things there. The first one goes back, I think, to the analytics tracker that I talked about. We do hear a whole bunch of different things. It takes 6 years to get a land use permit, or it takes, whatever to, there are statements that are made. It's too complex, it's too long, it's too hard. But when we try to dig down into, well, why? What's too hard? What's causing these delays? That's where it starts to get mysterious, and we don't get a lot of clarity on specifics. I think the analytics tool helps to cut through the rhetoric and put facts on the table. So you can look at that analytics tracker and say, okay, in the last year, how many permits did the boards issue? And what was the timelines for each of those permits? What are the timelines for a water license? All of those things. So that helps us to look at facts. There may be delays, and if there are delays, then we need to unpack that and figure out why. I do think, the second part to your question is, can we open up the devolution agreement and look for ways to expedite kind of processes? I would suggest the devolution agreement is not the tool or the place to do that. It's rather, I think you're looking at, is there something we can do with the legislation? So maybe, and there may be ways that we can look at efficiencies in implementing what's in the legislation as well. Sometimes changing the rules and the regulations, it takes a long time to do those things, because there's a lot of process and oversight involved in changing laws. And as I mentioned, there's tight connections between these laws and modern treaties. So sometimes you're not just changing a law, you have to open up a modern treaty in order to change something. It might not be the way to go. There could be other ways in terms of implementing what's in the legislation. And some of those things that we've heard that are taking a lot of time is building a whole bunch of management plans, or one of the things we focused on was bathymetry data. So some licenses are many, many, many pages because they list out the latitudes and longitudes of various lakes that may possibly be used in the future for, this or that. And that takes a lot of time and it costs a lot of money. And it might not be protective, a risk-based approach in terms of protecting rights or the environment. So I think there's value in looking at both of those options, the design and implementation of the system, but being very cognizant about limitations of changing both the design and risks of implementing things in certain ways And I think there is a lot of value in us working together to point out where those risks and opportunities are. So I think we need facts. We need to figure out, what is taking a long time. And then we need to think about where the efficiencies that don't have impacts on rights and on the environment. And I do think there is space to create those efficiencies. We do not want to throw out all the good work that's been done in the Northwest Territories around rights, the recognition of rights, the co-management nature of the system, or the environmental protections that are provided for this system. I think there is a lot of criticism about the time it takes, but there is a lot of there are a lot of different regimes looking to the Northwest Territories and across Canada's north as international models of, responsible resource management, respectful resource management. So we need to take those, we can't throw out those good things about the system. And I do think we need to work together to make it better and control the messaging, be mindful of the messaging. If we're saying that, it's hard and it's complex and everything else, and we don't have the facts to support those things. I think we heard from the Land and Water Boards yesterday about a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we keep saying how bad and how hard it is, then who's going to invest? I think we should be proud of what's there. It's a very progressive system that is protective of rights, of the environment, and there are definitely ways that we can work together to make it better and more efficient. So I think I would start with facts and then working together on design versus implementation.
Okay, my last comment there, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Make it brief, we're almost out of time.
Yeah, I'm recognizing time here. I'm real glad to hear you say efficiencies and reviews. If we can't use the devolution designed pilot project committee, or maybe the federal government and the 4 claimant corporations or the 4 settlement areas, the Clean-Cho, the Sahtu, the Gwich'in, and the Inuvialuit, covering a majority of the NWT with that co-management existence in each jurisdiction, should look at a co-management system of the regularly designing the regulatory process more efficiently. That's all I'm gonna say here. If we cover, if we the 4 claimant corporations amount to over half of the jurisdiction of the Northwest Territories, maybe that's a vehicle to use as a pilot project on efficiency of the regulatory process. Thank you. Thank
you, Mr. McNeely, for making the comment brief. I appreciate that. You squeezed in a third one. I'm going to recognize Mr. Morse. He's been waiting in the queue to ask a question, and then I'll do a final speed round if we can keep these short, these last couple, so we can meet, generally speaking, our 3 p.m. target. Mr. Morse, if you want to be as efficient as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will try to be quick. So just to follow up on something that was said earlier, Rebecca, you mentioned that, if any changes are going to be taken or being cautious around quick wins. I mean, I think the probably what we're talking about is the the amendments to the waters regs that the boards are talking about and the Cleachon government has talked about. So I assume that the concern you're raising there is just to ensure that the federal government kind of coordinates whatever changes are made if changes were to be made. So can you maybe speak to that one a little bit? And just clarify whether or not there's concerns about making those changes as requested, or just whether there's anything committee should be aware of if we were going to go down the road of kind of supporting those kinds of recommendations.
Thank you for that. Ms. Schwannard?
Sure. Yeah, I think that request applies. I don't know that the federal government needs to coordinate that per se, but I do think the federal government and the territorial government should be working with boards to better understand the issue and the problem that we're trying to solve, and that we should do our best to move in lockstep.
Okay, thank you for that. Anything further, MLA Morris? Well, we have you.
Yeah, thank you. Very quickly, I just asked this question to the boards yesterday and asked for you as well. I mean, if there's anything that we've missed, really what I'm hoping for is that we can get recommendations for things that GNWT can do differently, if any, to help, create more efficiency or predictability within the regulatory system, and got some pretty concrete recommendations from the board. So I was just wondering if there's anything that's been left out today that you were hoping to speak to. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for that. Director, if you would, on that note.
Thanks. I don't think there's anything different or more than what I've said already. I think capacity support, being mindful about how we do things, not just what we do, the operational actions that the boards are working on. I think, and that's teamed with pathfinding. I think those are concrete actions that the territorial government, along with the federal government, can do to support, whether it's templates or management, a way to manage or to reduce the amount of information required in management plans to meet sort of scales of economy for small exploration ventures primarily. And then just, again, sort of that whole of government approach to requests, thinking about the environment as well as economic development and rights and relationships. So I think, I know it's a little bit nebulous. I can't say do this specific thing, but I think, to act in that way, along those lines, in a collaborative sort of manner, is important.
Thank you. So folks, I do have a couple questions, but I wanted to put to all members in advance before I ask them. Does anyone have any other questions for our team online? Well, our guests are, yeah, okay, so I'm going to recognize Ms. MLA Morgan, and if anyone else has one last one before I jump in, I just want to make sure all committee members have a fulsome opportunity for time. So thank you. MLA Morgan, if you would, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So going back to the regional study, you mentioned this is the first one done under the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act, but there have been examples, perhaps in other parts of Canada, of regional environmental assessments. One of the terms, though, of this is that it would not interrupt any existing regulatory or planning processes. Are there examples in other regional environmental assessments where, large-scale development in the region has been paused to wait for the results of a regional study or regional environmental assessment, given that, say, like a transformative project such as Slave Geological Province that sort of like fundamentally transform the region, the idea that it could just keep chugging along or go in parallel with a regional study seems to me a little bit backwards, as opposed to being able to take the results of it and use that before we decide on a project that would transform the entire region. Are there examples in other regional environmental assessments where it's been sequenced so that the study or the environmental assessment finishes first, and then major regional projects, would happen after that? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Director, if you would, to the MLA's question. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not aware of any statutes that require that. However, I would say, the whole point, or one of the major points of having the regional studies under, as part of the critical minerals strategy, is that it's not uncommon for proponents to be, projects to be stalled, delayed, because participants, decision makers, whoever want that information to inform a project. And so I'd say the lack of information, we've seen that many, many times in the Northwest Territories and elsewhere, that project proceedings are slow or they're stalled because more information is needed in order to move forward. And often those asks are placed on the shoulders of proponents. And so, a single proponent may have to go and find a whole bunch of information or, about an entire region, and are often sort of saddled with cumulative impacts. So they might be the fourth company to come along, and all of a sudden there's a whole bunch of extra information that they're being asked because of what might be happening, because of other companies or because of a changing environment. And so I'd say, statutes that I'm aware of do not require, say that a strategic environmental assessment or regional study will or must occur before development. I think development projects are always coming online at different times and for different reasons, and sometimes really important reasons that people wouldn't want to stop. But I'd say specific projects, if there are questions or concerns about the development or how that development will interact with the natural environment or the sociocultural or economic factors at play, then projects often do get stalled.
Thank you. Anything further? No, nothing further. Okay, folks, I'll put it one last time to committee members, and I'll knock off a couple questions of my own. Anything further from committee? Not seeing any. Hopefully these will be relatively quick. I'm trying to ensure that they're efficient as well. I can't ask my committee to be efficient and not be. That said, Director, you mentioned noted capacity as an issue. I'm assuming you mean under the MPFR, or let me try it again, the MPFP. Have you made any, or are you able to make any recommendations how to address this problem of capacity, specifics to how that can be addressed? Thank you.
Yes, I think, well, I mentioned that there are early conversations underway about secondment opportunities. I know the government of the Northwest Territories has a specific secondment program in place. We're in early conversations with boards about how that could, how we could support some thinking around that. It's not just a matter of getting bodies in seats. I think, many of you will appreciate the amount of time it takes to really understand the regulatory regime in the Northwest Territories. It involves understanding treaties, understanding laws, understanding operations, like technical components of operations. It takes time to build up that capacity. And so hiring somebody to just walk into, fill a seat, isn't necessarily going to result in results, the following day. It's going to take some time. So I think some of the thinking being done right now by the boards is really creative around, are there regulatory officers that they have that can be lent or, or cycle through different Indigenous governments and organizations, or are there programs that they can kind of lead to help build that capacity? So I do think the boards are certainly better placed than we are to support that need. But if there's something that we can do to support boards, I think we should be looking at that. And there might be some space there for the territorial government to also support thinking around, creative secondments of people that have, the appropriate knowledge and background and can help kind of maybe something like a train the trainers type situation where it's not just somebody going on secondment, but it's somebody there to help build capacity within organizations.
Thank you. And if you can think of any that you'd like to put into writing, please send them to committee, around the issues that committee has a scope involvement with. And again, that's an invitation to transmit anything. That's it. Just a couple of quick other ones. Hopefully they will be quick. You mentioned exploring the water regulation amendment. There might be some requests. Is there anything you can share with us in writing? We don't have to go through it today, but Director?
Sorry, I think I missed, you cut out part of your question cut out. Are you asking about the regulations, or are you asking if there are other things beyond the regulations?
The MVOD, there was some exploring the water regulations, some amendment requests, potentially. Is there anything you can share in writing to committee? We don't have to go through it today. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, recommendations flowing from the MVOD session. I think as we plan for the virtual touchstone meeting, committee members, which includes officials from the government of the Northwest Territories, will be meeting to sort of summarize what we, what are the actionables and what are the things that we can do to work together. So I think there's some collective thinking that will be occurring in the coming weeks and months. So there may be some more concrete ideas coming out of those meetings that I think align closely with the objectives of this committee.
If you could share those at the time when it's appropriate, that would be helpful in writing, of course. Or if we need a presentation, that would be probably welcome, but we would have to discuss that. Just about at the end, you mentioned qualitative data in your analytics, if I understand correctly. What kind of data could be included in them? And, can you share some of that further? I think you might have mentioned, as well as, is it black and white? And I don't want to go on long, but I want to say that by saying you have a proponent who applies for a permit and gets a permit, all applicants are not equal. So how they get to that process, Rio has a different type of money who can say, for example, than a, junior two-person company. Hence, so how do you describe some of that, and can you maybe share that with committee in writing rather than extending it today? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would just note it's the boards that are leading that analytics work. I think our desire is for them to look at how they can build in qualitative data to advance, in their next step. Because we hear things about, okay, I got my permit fast, but I can't use it. Or, maybe a permit took a really long time because, there was a new technology that they were utilizing, or there were, communities didn't support what they were doing. So I just think sometimes that qualitative data helps us understand the issues better. But it is the boards who are leading that work. And I don't know how this is a request for us and a need that's been flagged. So I don't know how they will be going about that, or when, or what that could look like. I think Ryan Fiquette from the Land and Water Boards is the person leading on that work.
Fair enough. One last question, just for clarification, similar in line with MLA Morgan's in the sense of the nature of the general conversation, which was, as you're aware, the Grace Bay Port and Road in Nunavut is under EA and before the Nunavut Planning Commission. And I'm just curious, does this have any impacts on the regional study work you're doing, which focuses in on the NWT section? So if it's an easy answer, please do. I don't want to cause a lot of work and say otherwise put it in writing. I understand how much work that ends up entailing, but if it's an easy answer, I think we'd welcome it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it's an easy answer. That has been on our radar for sure, as conversations have been evolving on the regional study in the Slave Geological Province. The Kitikmeot Inuit Association is very closely involved in the governance work on the regional study in the Northwest Territories, recognizing, there are impacts across the geopolitical border. The government of Nunavut has also been, they've opted to be an observer to the process, so they are just watching what happens. At this point, we do not have an express interest from Inuit or the government of Nunavut to expand the project officially into Nunavut. Whether that process uses any of the outcomes, if they're available to inform their process, I guess has yet to be seen. But at this point in time, we have not received any expressions of interest to expand the study over the geopolitical border.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Okay, folks, not seeing anyone begging for a last second question, I'm just going to now proceed to closing. So what I'd like to begin with saying thank you, Director Schwinar, as well as Director Pauly, for your time, your insights, and your assistance. Your work and your time today is greatly appreciated by committee and our staff as we work towards to find better ways of doing things. It doesn't mean we want to do them less good. It just means we want to find ways to do them better. At this time, I'd like to thank you both for joining us, including your team here in our gallery, among the millions, of course, that are following online as well, as we all know. That may not be 100% true, but the tens of people who are watching probably is more accurate. Ultimately, at this point, I'd like to thank committee members as well and close the hearing at this time. And again, thank you. Have a lovely day, everyone. Cheers. And
Thank you.
committee members, stay online.